If you don't understand room acoustics and the specific goals of acoustic treatment, it's totally possible that you could spend hundreds, if not thousands of dollars on acoustic treatment and it barely make a difference in your space. Not kidding. But luckily, it doesn't actually have to be complicated, despite what other people say, to really understand your room acoustics and the goals of acoustic treatment. When it comes down to it, there's really just three main goals of acoustic treatment. And if you understand those goals and the little bit of easy science that goes in behind them, then you could absolutely create an amazing sounding home studio. Let's discuss. Welcome back to the Home Studio Pro podcast. We're helping you create professional sounding music from your home studio. I'm your host, Colin Cross, and today we're talking about room acoustics and acoustic treatment. And this is a really, really big piece of the puzzle of creating professional sounding music from your home studio, because if you want your music to sound good, your recordings probably need to sound good. And if your room sounds bad, your recordings are probably going to sound bad. $1,000 microphone in a bad sounding room is probably going to sound bad, but $100 microphone in a great sounding room, you could get amazing results. So the space cannot be removed from the room after the fact. If you want to get great recordings, you need to have a good space to be recording in. And the same goes for mixing. If you're trying to mix on speakers and the sound is coming out of the speakers and bouncing all around the room and ending up at your ears a jumbled mess, it's going to be really hard to get mixes that translate out to your car or to your Bluetooth speaker or wherever, because you're getting basically lied to you by your room about what's really going on in the mix. So room acoustics, acoustic treatment, it is a completely necessary piece of this puzzle that we can't just skip over. And my goal with this is to make it totally accessible. We're just going to go through the three goals and kind of what you need to understand behind those goals so that you can understand the room acoustics and acoustic treatment and why we do certain acoustic treatment, so that you don't just go out and buy stuff that isn't actually going to change the problem. As I said, you could spend hundreds, if not thousands of dollars trying to solve this problem and not really getting good results if you don't understand these few simple things that you need to understand. So we're going to break that down in today's video. Before we do, I just have to address the elephant in the room, or kind of lack of elephant in the room, if you will, and that is the lack of acoustic treatment / just small, good looking, but bad acoustic treatment that's behind me. If you're listening to the podcast version, you might be thinking, why is he talking about that? I do this on YouTube as well. And behind me, there's just a wall of a couple of acoustic panels that are not big enough at all. They look good, but they're not doing enough. And part of this series is that I'm overhauling the studio I built when I was like 22 years old. I didn't really understand the stuff with everything that I understand now, and I'm bringing you along that journey with me. So if you haven't subscribed on YouTube, definitely do. I'm overhauling this wall behind me very soon, maybe even this week, and building a huge acoustic wall behind me that's going to look really cool and sound great. So I'm currently in a space that doesn't sound good, but that's just a piece of this puzzle that I'm currently working on myself, of updating and overhauling this space. So don't judge me based on my current acoustic treatment. It's going to get better, but it looks good for now. It just doesn't sound very good. Anyway, that said, two things before we get into the three goals and kind of understanding what's going on behind them. The first is, if you don't have my Home Studio Pro checklist, be sure to download it. It just goes through 4 steps to setting up a professional home studio that makes creating professional sounding music easy. Your studio shouldn't get in the way of making professional sounding music. And this guide is very, very helpful. It has a lot of good information on acoustic treatment, which, as we said, is a piece of this puzzle that you have to understand. And in my opinion, is the second step in creating professional sounding music, because if your room doesn't sound good, it's going to be really hard to get recordings that sound good. So understanding this, and understanding what you need to do to create a great sounding room, is integral. If you've been following along with this podcast, you know this is kind of the second step. We talked about the first step, not kind of, this is the second step. We talked about the first step in the last episode. If you haven't checked out that video, definitely go watch that. It's going to be really helpful for you with your home studio journey. And my plan originally was to just do 4 episodes going through the 4 steps. Realized as soon as I started planning out my acoustic treatment episode, oh man, we got to break this down and slow this down a little bit. What I don't want to do with this podcast or with any of my content is do what basically the rest of the internet is doing, which is either putting out really clickbaity, bad information that will get clicks, or making things way too complicated and being kind of aggressively mean about it. I'm trying to do neither of those things. I'm trying to give you real, actionable, helpful advice, give you the meat and potatoes that is what you really need to understand, without making it super complicated and weird like some people do, and without giving you clickbaity stuff. Yes, this title is probably, quote, clickbaity to some people, but that's just to get you to click on the video. And also, it's true that you need to watch this before you buy acoustic treatment, and once you're in here, to actually get the value out of this that you need if you want a great sounding room, if you want to get great recordings. So grab the Home Studio Pro checklist from the link in the description below. We're going to take a little bit of time to go through these 4 steps on this podcast, so you can grab that and have it to reference back to anytime you want. Maybe get a little bit of a sneak peek in what's coming up in future episodes. But either way, I want you to have it so that you can quickly reference back to the stuff as you're designing and building your dream home studio. Okay, second thing before we really get into this episode is we really have to understand what acoustic treatment is and what it is not. Acoustic treatment is not soundproofing. If you're ever watching a video and someone points to an acoustic panel and says, I have my soundproofing over here, I put up these soundproofing panels, stop watching that video. That person does not know enough to teach you about acoustic treatment, because soundproofing is just a totally different thing. It's a literally just a different thing. 2 totally different goals and 2 totally different ways that you accomplish them. Soundproofing is about keeping what's in the outside world out of what's going on in this room and keeping what's going on inside this room from getting out into the outside world. Acoustic treatment doesn't care at all about the outside world. It's just about making what's going on inside this room sound great. That's all we're thinking about with acoustic treatment. To make something truly soundproof, which isn't a great word for it, by the way, isolation is better, but to make something truly soundproof, you almost always have to do some amount of construction. You have to seal all the air gaps. You have to do a lot of things to make your space isolated from the outside world. If you're interested in that, I recommend this book, Home Recording Studio by Rod Gervais. I think that's how you say it, like Ricky Gervais, I assume. I don't know Rod, but this book is super helpful. Highly recommend checking it out. It gets pretty into the weeds. This guy has built major major studios and really understands the building process, but also the acoustic design process for both the acoustic side of things, but also the soundproofing isolation side of things. So if you're interested in that, grab that book. If you are willing to put in the effort to build something, you should understand those principles. But for now, let's talk about acoustic treatment, what it is, making your room sound great. There's a whole separate set of goals, and we can really just break those down. So the 3 goals of acoustic treatment is 1, control early reflections before they reach your ears when mixing or your microphone when recording. So that's 1. 2, absorb as much of those reflections, frequency, content as possible. 3, trap low-end buildup. If you do those 3 things, that's all you really have to do with acoustic treatment to create a great sounding space and make sure that your speakers aren't lying to you if you're mixing, and make sure that your recordings are getting a nice, clean, clear picture of what it is you're trying to record. But let's break them down one by one so we really understand all the intricacies of it. So 1, control early reflections before they reach your ears when mixing or your mic when recording. This is so that it doesn't interfere with the clarity, imaging, or tone of what you're recording or listening to. So in order to understand this, the first thing we have to understand is what reflections are. So reflections are when a sound bounces off a surface and comes back. And so in this case, it bounces off a wall and gets back into your microphone, or off the desk and gets back in your microphone, or off the ceiling and gets back into your microphone. Or if you're mixing, bounces around the room and gets back into your ears and impacts the way that you hear it. And reflections behave in different ways depending on the size of the space, because volume of the source dies out, or the sound waves die out over distance. And so if you're in a really big room, the amount of energy that sound has when it hits that wall that's really far away from you is very low. And so the amount that of energy it's going to have when it bounces off that wall or reflects off that wall is going to be very low. And so distance matters, but also volume matters. So if I'm really, really quiet, you're not going to hear any of the reflections of this room at all. So if all you're doing is whisper singing, you might not necessarily need acoustic treatment, because you can be right up on the microphone, you can be whispering, and none of that sound from the room is going to bounce around and get back into the microphone and impact or distort the sound of the direct recording. But if you're loud at all, if you're normal volume at all, and you're in a small space, it does not take a lot of volume in a small space, which inherently most home studios are smaller spaces, for there to be a fair amount of energy by the time my voice just hits the ceiling or the wall or the desk or whatever and bounces back and gets back into this microphone. And then you don't just hear my voice, but you also hear my voice plus the reflection or reflections of my voice, which can change the sound that this microphone picks up, or if you're mixing, that your ears are hearing from the speakers. You're not just hearing the mix now, you're hearing the mix plus the reflections. So we need to control those. We need to try to not stop them, but just tame them or redirect them as much as possible so they're not just bouncing off that wall back into the microphone or back into our ears. So that's the first thing you understand, is just what reflections are. The second thing is phase. So every sound wave has a positive and negative cycle to it, or half cycle to it. There's one cycle that includes a positive side and a negative side. And that's what's called phase. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing negative about a negative half cycle of a sound wave. But what happens if my sound bounces off the wall and gets back into the microphone slightly later than the direct signal being recorded into this microphone is that I could have a negative half cycle that is now under a positive half cycle. And that can then essentially just lessen certain frequencies of my voice. Or if I have two positive cycles that overlap from my direct signal and the delayed signal, it could increase some frequencies of my voice. So it can just change the sound of what's getting in the microphone compared to if I stop those early reflections or at least minimize those early reflections, then what gets into this microphone is going to be a truer capture of the tone of what it is that I'm recording. So phase is a very big part of this that comes into play in a lot of different ways. And all you really need to understand is that there's that positive and that negative side of one cycle. So one cycle has positive and negative. And if you stack two positives, you're going to amplify certain frequencies or tones of the voice. And if you have it where the negative side is now under a positive side from the reflections, it can then be kind of canceling out some of the tone of that recording, whatever it is, the voice or drums or whatever it is you're trying to record. So phase is very, very clear. Now, this can impact the clarity of what we're hearing from our speakers or what's being picked up by the microphone, because we're hearing both the direct and the indirect signal, the reflected signals, and that's going to change how clear that picture is in the recording or in your ears. It also is going to change imaging, and this is very important if you're mixing, but let's say you're closer to one wall than another, the sound is going to bounce off that one wall and it's going to affect one ear differently than the other ear. And it's going to make it really hard to hear what's going on with your panning decisions. Just as you're setting up your mix in general, you're going to hear basically reflected signal throwing off and making the mix feel like it leans one direction or another when it doesn't. Again, you're being lied to about what's really going on inside that mix. And then it also is going to affect the tone. So to understand the tone and why it's affected by our reflections and why we're trying to control those reflections as much as possible, we need to talk about goal number 2 and understand the little bit of science behind that that's important. So goal number 2 is to absorb as much of the reflections frequency content as possible. So to understand this, we first have to talk about frequency spectrum. What does that mean? Well, our ears as humans, we can hear, for the most part, 20 hertz up to 20,000 hertz. As we age, we lose some of the hearing from the top down, so that is a variable, but not for what your microphone is hearing, but something to know about the human nature. But we hear roughly 20,000 or 20 hertz up to 20,000 hertz. If you've ever pulled up an EQ, you'll see those numbers on it, 20 on the far left side, 20,000 or 20K on the right side. That's the frequency spectrum. Now, frequencies correspond with length. So as I mentioned earlier, every sound wave has one cycle, and that cycle has a positive and a negative half cycle. Well, those cycles correspond with a specific length that it takes for that sound to develop. And it functionally is just from the sub-frequencies, they're super, super long, several feet long. And as you move up the frequency spectrum up into the high frequencies, they can be extremely short, fractions of inches deep. And so it's totally different to capture low frequencies or even mid-range frequencies than to capture super high frequencies because they're very short, they're very small. And so if you have just a very thin acoustic panel, like just a cheap foam panel from Amazon, you might be able to capture a fair amount of the high frequencies because they're very short. But if you're recording acoustic guitar and you have a bunch of mid-range information, then you probably also want to be capturing the mid-range and maybe even some of the low-end frequencies to be able to get an accurate representation when it's getting captured into that microphone and those frequencies aren't getting bounced back. Because functionally, if you put up just very thin acoustic treatment, the problem with these panels behind me is there are a bunch of different thicknesses, and some of the thicknesses are like maybe a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch. That's not hardly capturing anything, right? And most foam panels have some sort of design, quote unquote, that's cut into them that makes some part of them basically a 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch, something like that. And that's not even talking about the density. Just so if the density is enough of the foam, that could be okay if it was 2 or 3 inches. But if you have a 1/2 inch piece of thin foam, or even if it was good enough density foam, but it's a 1/2 inch, it's only going to capture those super high frequencies. So we're not doing anything for all the rest of the sound. If you've ever looked at an EQ or the RTA on the analysis of what's going on on a sound, on an EQ, being able to really watch it, you'll see that most sounds, their fundamentals, their main part of their tone is existing around 200 to 300 hertz. So if you're not doing anything to capture the reflections around 200 to 300 hertz, you could be losing so much body from your recording. And once it's recorded with that reflection captured in the microphone, you can't change that. That just affected the sound of it. And so this also gets really interesting and weird when you're talking about the different lengths and the different ways that that's going to interact with the microphone or with your ears across the frequency spectrum because of the different lengths of the waveform. So because some are several inches and some are several feet, or some are just a fraction of an inch, different frequencies will reflect off the wall differently, meaning that some, by the time they get back to your microphone or your ears if you're mixing, are going to be in a positive half cycle when your voice was in a positive half cycle as it hit the microphone, and some are going to be in a negative half cycle. So different frequencies will be interacting differently with the microphone or with your ears. So you will be hearing things where some frequencies are amplified, some have basically nothing happening to them, and others could be almost canceled out depending on how aggressive that reflection was. It could at least be minimized. So some things are going to be amplified, some things are going to be minimized. This can create something called comb filtering, which is if you just imagine a comb being shoved down on your EQ, canceling out a bunch of frequencies or at least minimizing a bunch of frequencies while others kind of get boosted a little bit. And again, that just gets baked into the microphone and sounds weird. It sounds weird, guys. Very unnatural, very unnatural. And you could also be hearing comb filtering as you're mixing. What you're hearing coming out of your speakers and bouncing around the room, when you hear it in your ears, you could basically have a bunch of frequencies that are emphasized and others that are minimized or canceled out completely depending on the size of your room. So we really got to avoid comb filtering. So it's important that we have acoustic treatment that is thick enough, that we're not just only capturing the high frequencies. Most cheap foam panels are too thin, right? And so my rule of thumb with acoustic treatment is that it should be at least 2 inches for most of your panels, but you also kind of need a range. So we're going to put this all together, but you need at least 2 inches, and a foam panel that is 2 or 3 inches in some sections, but then only quarter inch in other sections is not doing enough, most likely, for you to really stop or control those reflections. Okay. And functionally, what this really all points to is that how we address 200 hertz and above because of the length of the frequencies is totally different than how we affect 200 hertz and below because of the length of those frequencies, which leads us to goal number 3, which is to trap low-end buildup. So, what you need to understand here is that because low frequencies are so long, they don't just reflect like higher frequencies. They reflect some, but they're a little less directional than high frequencies. But beyond that, they also resonate with the room. So depending on the dimensions of your room, the room could basically be resonating in a way that is augmenting some of those frequencies, or because they're impacted by phase in the same way, it could be kind of nulling out or canceling out some of those frequencies as well. So you could have some frequencies in the low end that you hear way too high, so you always turn down when you're mixing, or your microphone gets way too much of 72 hertz or whatever, but then not nearly enough of 60 hertz because it kind of gets nulled out depending on the dimensions of your room. And so because they're so long and because they're fairly omnidirectional, meaning that high end bounces off the wall, comes straight back, pretty directional. Low end, because it's so long, it's going to bounce around a little less directionally. You don't have to stop it in specific points as much as you have to stop mid to high frequencies in a specific place to really capture it so it doesn't hit your ears in the wrong way or microphone in the wrong way. With low end, because it's not very directional, you could just trap it where it makes the most sense and where you get the most impact out of having acoustic treatment in those places. So because it resonates with the room and because the way the air travels in the room, you tend to get the most buildup, they call it, but that's kind of not the best word, but buildup in the corners of the room. And so by putting super deep treatment in the corners of your room, you can capture and contain some of that low end, trap it, as they say. And so corner treatment is a great place to capture your low end. Beyond that, just having very thick panels, some amount of very thick panels in your room that can trap that low end information is extremely helpful. So whereas I said with mid to high frequencies, minimum 2 inches, with low end, minimum 4, but really usually more like 6 inches to start capturing the low frequencies, and even deeper can be helpful. And so you want varied acoustic treatment with specific goals in different places. So we'll go more in depth about where and what type of acoustic treatment, all that stuff in an upcoming episode. But just to have a quick overview of putting all this together. So we have our 3 goals. We want to control early reflections before they reach your ears when mixing, or your mic when recording. And this is so they don't interfere with our clarity, imaging, or tone. Our second goal is that we want to absorb as much of the reflections frequency content as possible, not just the highs, not super thin panels. And this is key for avoiding phase issues and comb filtering across the frequency spectrum. And then 3, we want to trap low-end buildup using bass traps, especially in corners, to reduce room modes and get more accurate mixes and cleaner recordings. Now, if you're not recording, just a quick note before we put this all together, if you're not recording anything but vocals and you're not mixing on speakers in your room, you don't need to worry about bass and low end probably at all, maybe a very, very slight amount, but for the most part, vocals might barely touch into the low end part of the frequency spectrum. A lot of vocals, the tone is mostly in the mid-range and up. It varies a little bit, depends on the voice. So I don't want to say that as a blanket statement, but you could probably get away with just mid-range focused acoustic panels and specifically placed to eliminate reflections or minimize reflections into the microphone. For if all you're doing is singing and if you're mixing on headphones, that's all you probably need to worry about. But as soon as you're talking about anything else, basically recording anything else and mixing with speakers, anything like that, then you have to start thinking across the entire frequency spectrum. So mid and up, and specific treatment. So if we go through them in order, we want to control early reflections before they reach our ears. So we need specifically placed panels for mid-range and upper frequencies, so that either to make sure that it's not bouncing back into the microphone, the sound is hitting the wall, but it's not bouncing back into the microphone, or if we're mixing, it's not coming out of the speakers and bouncing off the walls to the sides of us or ceiling or even desk. But you're probably not going to put acoustic treatment on your desk, but you want to be wary of that, thoughtful of it, and making sure that when it hits that, we try to capture as much of those reflections and keep it from just reflecting straight back into our ears. And then because we're trying to absorb as much of the frequency content as possible of those reflections, we need our panels to be at least 2 inches thick, but ideally more like 4 inches thick in a lot of cases, especially in places where you're getting the most and highest energy reflections. So in some studios, depending on the dimensions of your room, that could be your sidewalls. In some studios, it might be the wall behind your speakers. In some studios, it might be the wall directly behind you, where it's coming out of the speakers and hitting that wall and pretty quickly getting back to you. So it depends a little bit on your specific setup where the most content and the highest energy reflections are going to be. But for the most part, you want to treat next to you and behind the speakers with some amount of acoustic treatment that's at least 2 inches, if not 4 inches thick, and not just cheap foam panels, but panels that are actually 2 or 4 inches thick. And then we need to trap the low end buildup. And typically speaking, that is easiest and most effective in corners, but you can also trap low end buildup with thicker panels in other places of the room. Clouds are a great place to have a thicker panel because they're above you. You don't have to worry about losing room space from them in the same way, especially right above your mix position. So you could have some 6.5 inch cloud panels that are capturing a lot of that low end. And if you just think about acoustic treatment across those 3 goals and you're intentional with your placement, which again, we're going to talk about placement more in an upcoming episode. But if you're just intentional and thoughtful in what acoustic treatment you get and where you place it, so that you are controlling early reflections, you're capturing as much of those reflections frequency content as possible, and you're trapping low end, then you can have an amazing sounding room. It's totally possible to have an amazing sounding room in a home studio, but it's really important to understand that this stuff is, to some extent, maybe even more important in home studios in some cases, because they're inherently smaller rooms and because they're squares or rectangulars, they have a bunch of parallel surfaces. Sound can just bounce back and forth between those 2 walls and really build up, really cancel out, create all sorts of fast reflections, flutter echoes, things like that sound weird, make it impossible to get a great recording in them without acoustic treatment. But with acoustic treatment, they can sound amazing. There's no reason that they couldn't sound amazing. So if you understand this stuff and you're intentional about how you apply it, there's no reason you can't have a great sounding room. But you just need to understand these 3 goals, and you just need to go after them thoughtfully and intentionally. And as long as you do that, it's totally possible to get amazing recordings and amazing mixes in a home studio. Okay, as I said, this is kind of just the primer episode for talking about acoustic treatment, because if you don't understand these core principles, the goals of acoustic treatment, and the little bit of sciencey things that's going on behind the scenes of those goals, then it's going to be impossible to have a real discussion around acoustic treatment. And that's one reason I think the content around this stuff can be bad, because people just aren't talking about what's going on behind it, or maybe they don't understand what's going on behind it. But if you understand what's going on behind it, you're intentional with your choices, we can do something amazing here. So this is the starting point of this. We're going to explore different types of acoustic treatment and placement for your different goals in upcoming episodes. So definitely come back for that. If you don't already have it, be sure to grab my Home Studio Pro checklist, where we're going through the 4 steps of creating your dream home studio that makes creating professional sounding music easy, completely free, from thebandguide.com/home studio pro checklist, all one word, or the link in the description below. If you're watching this on YouTube, I'd love to hear from you. Was this helpful? Which one of these surprised you the most? Please let me know in the comments below. Or if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, please leave a review and just say that you're enjoying this podcast. This is still a new podcast. It makes a huge difference for other people deciding to listen to this podcast. If they see that it has good reviews, it makes a huge difference for Apple Podcasts to know to show it to other people if it actually has good reviews and feedback from people. So if you're listening to this, be sure to leave a review. If this was helpful, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next week in another episode.
One thing at a time, I can